Hi there. The United States and China have reached agreement on measures to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with Beijing and put a trade war on hold. What does that mean for Chinese homegrown businesses? Meanwhile, a well-known Chinese entrepreneur was put under the spotlight for defending the company's business choices. Is there a conflict between patriotism and business profit? And as Chinese companies reach a critical stage in their push for overseas expansion, what further challenges lie ahead? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Andy Mock, founder and managing director of Red Pagoda Resources, and David Mahon, executive chairman of Mahon China Investment Management Limited. We shall also cross over to speak to Robert Cab, director of the Economist Corporate Network based in Hong Kong. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our discussion here in the Beijing studio. David, first of all, what do you think of the deal between the United States and China? Is it a good deal?
Is it a deal? I think it's I think, as you said, it's a truce, perhaps, a hiatus, in what has so far been quite a phony trade war. I don't think the trade war yet has the momentum to have us concerned that it will go to any great depth. So it's promising that they didn't basically fall out and lose any chance of continuing conversation. So we've got a continued discussion. That's always healthy. But I don't really think the trade war has set in as people have thought.
And your thoughts about the deal?
Well, I agree with David. I think, that it really is, it's an agreement to agree, in that I think there's nothing specific hammered out. There are still question marks. I think one of the big challenges, though, is that on the American side, what actually do the Americans want? Because clearly there's two camps, one led by Steve Mnuchin that is looking primarily for a trade deal to avert a trade war, and then we have Robert Navarro, or Peter Navarro, and Robert Lighthizer on the other side saying, look, we have to stop China, keep them from overtaking the United States. So I think even within the administration itself, it's hard to, I think, figure out what really is the United States' position.
Let me cross over to Robert. Hi. Secretary Ross will be coming pretty soon on the heels of the latest round of negotiations between the two sides. He is said to be the guy who will look at details, focus on one item after another, talking about drastic increase in China's purchase of American products. What do you think will be happening?
It's anyone's guess, I think, in this current environment. Just as the previous comments alluded to, we have, one, something that so far doesn't have details, and two, even contentions within the U.S. about what is acceptable. I mean, Trump basically has said, you need to seriously reduce this trade deficit, China, which by the U.S. calculations approaches $400 billion. There has been word out over the weekend that China was prepared to reduce that by about half, which, if anything like that happens, would be considered, I think, real progress. But, these things are easier said than actually executed, and so I think more than the details per se, it'll be the action. And the action will take anywhere from, the next few quarters to even years. So we're really just going to have to see how it plays out. I think if there's an indication of progress in the next, say, 3 to 6 months, that'll probably keep things on track and prevent tensions escalating.
Our analysis about the immediate deliverables coming out of the latest development between the two sides is one thing. The other thing, I'm afraid, is more interesting regarding the immediate local response towards the results of the negotiations. For example, President Trump comes under fire from both Republicans and Democrats and from the media in drafting this deal. I mean, tough guys show their apparent dissatisfaction with results. What do you think lies behind the widespread dissatisfaction on the American side?
I think America, or Trump in particular, is trying to satisfy something that is bringing together disparate facts. First of all, China is not the cause of America's deficit. America had deficits for 40 years before China became a significant player in global trade, which is somewhere around 2005. So if you look at also the deficit nature of the American nation. It's a country that borrows, lives beyond its means, whereas China is a saving nation. China is a nation that has accrued considerable capital, and it is also the last step in a whole range of steps for manufacturing within Asia. It's not the sole source of what is then shipped to the States. So trying to resolve a disparate trade situation based on the wrong data in the first place means that it's very confusing. But I think there's something bigger than this. The technological focus of this so-called trade war is about containing China from reaching a technological level where it really can compete with the United States. So politically, I think what is behind this is not domestic economics or balance of trade, but a greater scenario, which is America's retrenching and shrinking at the moment, and China is slowly and steadily, relentlessly emerging. And so it's a political issue. Trade is but a weapon in that attempt to contain.
A senior guy on the American delegation said to the media that China agreed to accept the $200 billion punitive tariffs on our exports. Now, immediately, the spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry said no. We would not consider seriously $200 billion. So what do you think of the differentiation between the American statement and the Chinese official rhetoric?
Well, I think one of the issues that's causing this is there is a remarkable lack of message discipline on the part of the White House, meaning that in previous administrations, you look at the Obama administrations before that, there was enormous attention paid to everyone saying the same thing. And here we have, I think, Larry Kudlow, who I think you're referring to, saying that there was an agreement with a specific number attached to it. I think Trump might be saying something different. But if we step back, I think what's important to recognize the political dynamic here is that Trump is, if anything, for better or worse, intensely ego-driven. And I think he probably sees this glittering prize of a Nobel Peace Prize in front of him for resolving the Korea crisis.
By the way, what's the chance for President Trump to win the Nobel Peace Prize?
Absolute zero.
Zero?
Yeah.
That would be a very sad blow for him.
I think he's got a good shot at it. And I think that this is something that we look at his history from his days of being a real estate developer in Manhattan to Atlantic City to being on The Apprentice. One thing that has been consistent, he very, very much cares about this type of recognition. And what better prize would there be than winning the Nobel Peace Prize? And I think that this, in a sense, is making him very amenable to many things that, from a purely economic perspective,
if President Trump were to take home something meaningful from the summit meeting in Singapore between Kim Jong-un and him about denuclearization, then there's a silver lining about the Nobel Peace Prize. Let me go back to Robert. What do you think of the gossip that your president will take home a Nobel Peace Prize? For what?
Well, I mean, it's been given to more controversial figures in the past, certainly. So I agree with Andy. There's definitely the chance. But the chance entirely hinges on what an even more erratic leader, Kim Jong-un, can manage to produce. I mean, it really is in the North Korean side of this. Not to say that the U.S. doesn't also have to work, and that's why, Trump would be eligible for the prize. But it's the nuclearization of North Korea that's at issue here. So if Kim Jong-un plays ball, then it should be both gentlemen would get the prize. Like that idea or not, that is how the prize works. It rewards people who bring about tangible progress for the sake of world peace. And sometimes it's gone, like I said, to very controversial figures in the past. So Trump would just be among those. And if he does get it, then indeed, it does seem to be on his agenda. It would be one of the things he would like to do.
The global audience might show great interest or more interest in the presidential tweets of Donald Trump instead of what the White House spokesperson says every day. President Trump said that he and President Xi Jinping have agreed to put the ZTE back into work, and that caused an uproar among the lawmakers in the D.C. They said, no way, they would still punish the ZTE. What do you think would happen to this electronic manufacturing giant in China? Robert?
Well, yeah, so in the case of ZTE, actually there's lots of opinions about this, but in legalistic interpretation is that the U.S. Justice and Commerce Department made an assessment that ZTE was in violation of trade sanctions the United States had on Iran, and in violation of that, they were then punished. They were given a fine, and they were supposed to comply. They didn't abide by the terms of the compliance, and that's why there's been this.
Excuse me, Robert. Management of ZTE did plead guilty about violations of some American laws. However, the Chinese complaints focus on the degree or severity of the punishment, whether ZTE should be sentenced to the death, the death penalty, the capital punishment, or it is a few years imprisonment. I mean, that makes a sea difference. It seems a lot of the lawmakers really want to kill ZTE once and for all.
Well, I mean, I think that wasn't necessarily part and parcel of the U.S. I think it was actually the Commerce Department who made the ruling on that. But you're correct. That would be the net effect. And ZTE basically shut down operations a few days ago. So the Chinese perspective on that is quite correct, that it was basically a death sentence. And then you could, I think, very fairly argue, isn't that going too far? Shouldn't there be another round of discussions with ZTE to work this out instead of you didn't comply, therefore we're going to, make you go out of business? So I think if we were to take a more, say, charitable interpretation of Trump's tweet and not take what some of the U.S. Congress have said about it, then he's just being more pragmatic. And I think there's a good argument to make that, should you wipe out a company because of a violation? Granted, by U.S. law, it's a big violation, but still, I think there's some justification for saying there should be some compromise here to try to work things out.
Thank you so much, David. China will significantly increase purchases of American goods and services. What will be those things we'll import? Soybeans, Boeing planes, what else? Energy, of course. But we're going to spend a lot of forex reserves on that. But the issue is whether the United States stands ready to deliver so much product.
Well, on soya beans, which people make a lot of reference to, actually the other sources of soya beans, Latin America, for an example, are a much better quality than is available out of the States. So Chinese farmers and food processors would rather only buy American soya beans as a secondary option.
The surge in our nationalist sentiments at this moment in the public debate about whether we should import more from the United States may focus on the genetically transformed food. And, opinions here are seriously divided. Some accuse the United States of, trying to poison the Chinese consumers with the genetically transformed stuffs. What do you think of the Chinese grievances and very serious accusations?
I think the accusations are fanciful. I don't think that's the intention. I think what is the concern, and it's not just China, all over the world, what are genetically modified products? What's the long-term effect on the body? What's the long-term effect on the cultivar, for instance, that has been modified? So those are things that we're still not sure of. So that general GM concern and skepticism is a global issue. I think the issue for the United States is that there are many things that the US will not sell to China, particularly in the technical area, the technical sectors. They've long been blocked. If you think, I forget the name of the organization, but it approves shipments to foreign countries of technology. China's about 10% of its turnover per year, but it takes a quarter of the team that runs this in Washington to do the assessment on what goes to China. So there is a very serious and very clear view that somehow we cannot let, America says to itself, China have high technology in certain areas. If that were resolved, then very quickly China will be buying a lot from America, because China needs to buy technology internationally, and America is still the source of a lot of very good technology. Once you go out of that, some of the other categories, if you look at scrap metal, is one of the biggest areas of what is, for instance, shipped to China from the US. The other areas relate more to Boeing, yes, if you're buying aircraft, but China can retaliate if it ends up not coming to an agreement. Many of the things that it depends upon from the US, it can buy elsewhere, and in doing so, deliver real commercial coups, such as buying aircraft from Airbus. And also, China has an ability to endure, which is not a common trait in the modern American economy. China knows how to shirku, eat a bit of bitterness. And so if it has to go for a couple of years, if this thing does get some depth, then China's more likely to outlast the US.
I'll jump in very quickly with this. Just you mentioned Boeing airplanes. I mean, Boeing aircraft is actually a relatively easy way because we see in some of the English language media that this 200 billion number is just impossible to achieve. But Boeing aircraft sell for between $100 million to over $300 million per plane. China's aviation market is expected to be the first trillion-dollar market. I think there's a need for 5,000 plus aircraft. 2,000 planes get you to about $200 billion. I mean, put aside the backlog that Boeing has, but I think there are ways to where China can realistically significantly increase its purchases, and the question is just finding that right mix.
And Robert, some say China-U.S. trade tensions expose China's reliance on American technology. China may be the world's low-cost producer of smartphones, but Chinese companies can't operate without American components, technology and operating systems, Android or you name it. What's your take on this?
Well, I think that can sometimes be exaggerated. We all, I mean, all as in all countries, exist in a global trading system. And it's true that if we talk about like the Android platform, that is necessary for a lot of mobile phones. But not long ago, those of us who are old enough to remember, in the 90s, NEC had another operating system that competed with Windows and Apple and so forth. And even WeChat, if you look at the kind of ecosystem it's developed, the comment that was made recently on how it is in fact effectively creating a kind of ecosystem that is its own resource and is unique, and others that would like to benefit from, say, WeChat Pay and so forth would have to use that. So it's not like China doesn't have this either, and increasingly have it. So the fact is, when you're in a global trading system, some countries are going to have items like components, and some countries are going to take the lead in manufacturing smartphones. So you might have chips from the US and smartphones from China, and the two actually interrelate. Yes, when you have an issue like we've seen with ZTE, it can make it look like China's weak, but at the same time, if the US were to cut off supply of various items from China, it would also suffer. So it's not like China's unique in that regard. I think there just needs to be a more balanced understanding that all countries that are active in the global trading system are exposed in these ways.
Thank you. David, China's input into the setting of global standards for fifth-generation technologies for telecommunication has become a more highly charged after the recent export ban on components to ZTE. Do you think this is a deliberate move to derail China's 5G programs? Why is it so important for China to assume leadership in the area of the fifth generation?
I think both America and China are desirous of owning the technology that will underpin 5G. And I think that's just an ordinary commercial competition. I mean, if you take nationality out of it, anyone that has the means to be the standard will do so. And we've seen it, we see it now with smartphones as Android fights with Apple systems. So I think that, in a sense, although when we talk about China and America, there are many parts of these countries, and there are many aspects to the motivations behind certain actions. I think there are many in the Republican Party who are appalled at the prospect of even a trade war, because the Republicans are traditionally pro-trade. Then there are those that have a more imperial competitive instinct. And in America, they see the rise of China as something to be resisted at all costs. And yes, marginalizing technology is part of that. So in a sense, we're dealing with multifaceted players on both sides. But in the end, it appears that this vote that was taken, I think, a year ago, that contentiously was resisted by Lenovo, means that we're going to end up with the Qualcomm system. It'll be an American system. But in the end, does that matter so much? After its first year of being tested in parts of North Asia, once China begins to run it, China will still, in effect, because of the huge size of its market, have a lot of leverage in terms of the whole mobile phone system sector.
A case that took place 2 years ago surfaced again recently about Mr. Liu Chuanzhi, the renowned Chinese entrepreneur. Now, what do you think about the recent backlash against this Chinese computer manufacturer by netizens on the issue of 5G, 5G standards voting blown out of proportion?
Well, I think it's hard to say whether it's blown out of proportion or not. I mean, I think the timing is very peculiar that it suddenly became such a hot story in China. But I think we need to recognize that both 5G and AI, artificial intelligence, are crucial areas, not just for economic development, but for military superiority as well. And I think this is why both the U.S. and China see this as almost a kind of a death match, that, each country has to be able to establish leadership here, and that it will have global repercussions for decades. And within that context, now we look at this Lufthansa issue where Lenovo backed the Qualcomm standard for one set of standards, and I think it was the data standards, not the command standards of 5G, but then did back Huawei's Polar standard. So I think it's not as clear-cut that Huawei is not being patriotic in its support of the standards. And I think this makes it also very difficult for companies like Lenovo that are global players, and even Huawei as well, in that on the one hand, Lenovo has a $2 billion deal with Qualcomm, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the mobile world. So that how do you thrive in a world where your biggest supplier is Qualcomm, and also be patriotic? So I think Lenovo and Lufthansa is in a difficult position.
Do you think because Lenovo has been so supported by the government and almost pushed on us as being the patriotic choice for some years, as opposed to Huawei to some degree, which is more of a private sector player, that the perception here is that therefore they should behave like a national champion? And I think that's what
we all know that I believe all of you three guys have been very close to corporate governance. The issue, by the end of the day, Robert and David, as well as Andy, which is more important for an entrepreneur, particularly the top business executive, CEO, president, or whatever you call them? Is the issue of patriotism more important than corporate profits for the business entity? Which is more important? Now, if you show your fervent patriotism at the cost of the corporate profits, do you think that's the way we're going to play that game?
Well, I can answer this from a Western governance perspective, where I think one can legitimately say the CEO or the founder of a publicly listed company ought to put patriotism first. And the reason for this is, so short-term profitability, of course, is one important metric, but the survival of the entity has to have priority. And we look even in a place like the United States, but especially in a country like China, where the support of the government is crucial. I think that even if we were to use a Western governance model to say the right decision, the smart decision is to be patriotic, and certainly in China, the governance system has some overlap with that of the U.S. and other Western countries, but also I think has some different principles as well. So,
in the age of globalization, Robert, it seems free flow of technologies, capitals, human resources should be the hallmarks of this new era. However, what happened recently in Google captured the media attention. For example, employees of this giant offered to resign because authorities of Google have agreed to cooperate with the U.S. military in their R&D, and that has caused great anger from the employees. However, in the era of high-tech or globalization, it seems national security as well as the issue of patriotism seem to be featured more prominently today than before. What do you think of the reasons behind?
Well, I mean, I think it's actually a very good question, Yang Ray, because it shows where does one's morality lie. Although I would think those researchers who have resigned at Google are probably loyal Americans, they also have issues with the idea of giving a very powerful technology to any military. So it becomes a higher moral standard. You know, how should this technology be used? Just like there are many loyal Americans who support Edward Snowden. Many others consider him a traitor, but it's a legitimate debate. What should be the limits of government with this technology? I think that's what that revolves around. I think it's simplistic if we just say patriotism equals supporting a certain standard for a certain nation or having a country serve a certain nation. I think there's a higher standard of being loyal to the human race and you know, better life for everybody. I think that's what that reflects.
Google and, Robert, again, Google and Microsoft, both U.S. homegrown, compete vigorously against each other, lodging in legal complaints against each other all the time. Would that be deemed as unpatriotic if the two were Chinese companies?
Well, this is another great question, Yang Ray. I'm afraid the sort of tenor I'm perceiving in China is that maybe that would be the case, which is strange. You know, you get a stronger Chinese tech sector if Chinese companies compete. Even if you have a foreign standard, if the Chinese companies benefit by that standard, that doesn't really hurt China. It makes China stronger. So if you have a good competitive marketplace in China, China will do better. By the way, with Lenovo, it bought IBM ThinkPad, remember. Its whole personal computer line came from an American company. It's because we didn't say, oh no, we can't give this technology to China, that now Lenovo has been able to thrive with that. So I think we need to have a little bit more openness when we think about these things.
And David, do you agree with Robert?
To a degree. I think we should perhaps be careful of the word patriotism. There's nationalism as well, which is I dress myself up in all the things I think is making me exceptional about my country, and you other cultures are the other. And I define myself by my exceptionalism, which is a terrible thing. Patriotism is a humbler thing. Patriotism is I will die for my country. I will serve my country. I will give something up for my country. And I think patriotism is a good thing. I think both Americans and Chinese have a great deal of patriotism, a lot more than many other countries. Sometimes it's a bit misdirected and misconstrued, but this need for loyalty, this requirement for loyalty, and I think in a country where the state has, as Andy said, played such a role in the whole evolution of commerce, there is probably a different standard in China of what is expected of Chinese companies. But I think Robert's point about the higher morality and those that do not wish to support a military complex, perhaps, if that comes along, that's a conundrum. But we would always hope we would then choose for humanity and not just our own nations.
Now, what do you think of the tone of most of the editorials of Global Times? Do you prefer to call that nationalism, commercial nationalism, on the issue of patriotism?
I think the Global Times, I think, has taken a fairly, perhaps the word I might use is mature view of this, because when we look at Liu Tongzhi, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to call him one of the fathers or the father of the modern IT industry. I mean, starting with the Chinese Academy of Science, the first electronic tube computer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He's someone that's made enormous contributions to the development of the IT sector that allowed companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent to exist today. So to look at one act in isolation and say, that makes him, unpatriotic or a traitor, I think that might be not seeing the bigger picture. And, my recollection serves, Global Times, I think, had a somewhat similar view as well, to say, let's not go overboard here. But I want to make a quick point about what Rob said, though, about Lenovo's acquisition of ThinkPad. Times have changed, too, and this might not be approved in the political climate in the United States today. So I think we all need to keep aware of the changing environment, and that does change, I think, the definition of what patriotism is.
But Microsoft was losing as a producer of hardware. It wanted to go back to being a core software company. So selling ThinkPad was an exit strategy from a sector it didn't want to be in.
Sure, from a business decision. But we could also see CFIUS or, the American president, whether that was Trump or Obama. Now the tide has turned and said, we have to stop the advance of China's technological advance.
Right. In a word, on both sides we have some internal divisions or controversies. On the U.S. side is the battle between Mnuchin and Navarro. On our side is between the netizens in their millions and Liu Tongzhi, founding father of Lenovo, about what is patriotism. The definition is very interesting today in the age of globalization, when corporate profits would be complicated by the idea of a global assembly line or a global industrial value chain. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.